So, you've probably heard the name Avicenna, right? It's one of those names that just kind of echoes through history. But what if I told you that this one man, living 1,000 years ago, wrote a single book that became the most important medical text on the entire planet for centuries? It's an incredible story, and one that really reshaped the very definition of medicine. Okay, so let's start with a question. Think about it. In our world, everything's constantly being updated, right? New software, new research, new everything. So how long could a single medical textbook possibly remain the undisputed authority in universities all the way from the Middle East to Europe? A century? Maybe two? The answer? Over 600 years. And no, that's not a typo. For 6 entire centuries, one book by one man was the absolute foundation of medical education. I mean, that kind of influence is it's almost unheard of in the entire history of science. And the man who wrote it, well, that was Avicenna. So the world knew him as Avicenna, but he had a ton of titles. The most famous one? The Prince of Physicians. But honestly, calling him just a physician, that's kind of like calling Leonardo da Vinci just a painter. It doesn't even begin to cover it. No, this guy was a true polymath. I mean, a philosopher, an astronomer, a geologist, a logician, a psychologist. He was even a poet. He wrote over 450 works in his lifetime. And what's just mind-blowing is that he did all of this while his life was, well, in constant chaos. So Avicenna was born around 980 CE in what's now Uzbekistan. This was smack in the middle of the Islamic Golden Age, a period of absolutely incredible scientific and cultural progress. It was this vibrant crossroads for Greek, Persian, and Islamic ideas. But here's the thing, it was also a time of crazy political instability. Yeah, his life was just this wild study in contrasts. I mean, just look at this journey. He starts out as a child prodigy, but then his empire collapses and he's forced to become a wandering scholar. He even becomes a grand vizier, think of it like a prime minister, only to get thrown in prison when the political winds changed. And yet, through all that chaos, his intellectual focus was just unbreakable. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of who he was. You know, his friends would tell him, hey, maybe slow down a bit, take care of your health. And he just refused. He was driven by this relentless need to experience and systematize as much knowledge as he possibly could. It was this very drive that led him to create 2 of the most important books in history. Okay, so he produced 2 absolute masterpieces. The first one was called the Book of Healing. But here's the catch. It had nothing to do with medicine for the body. Nope, this was a massive philosophical encyclopedia, and its whole purpose was to cure the soul's ignorance through reason and pure logic. At the core of this whole thing is a concept he called necessary existence. Basically, he argued that God is the one and only thing whose existence is, well, necessary. It doesn't depend on anything else. Everything else in the universe, you, me, the stars, we're all just contingent. We could exist, sure, but our existence completely depends on that single original source. And let me tell you, this idea would go on to reshape metaphysics, the study of reality itself, for centuries. But all this heavy philosophy wasn't just some abstract thought experiment. It actually led him to a pretty groundbreaking conclusion about science. He basically said, hey, just looking at stuff isn't good enough to get real knowledge. You needed something called tajriba, a method of active, rigorous experimentation and testing. He was, in essence, laying the groundwork for what we now call the scientific method. Which brings us to his second masterpiece. And this is the one that would dominate the world for more than 600 years. After he wrote The Cure for the Soul, he went ahead and wrote The Cure for the Body, the Canon of Medicine. You know, the genius of the canon wasn't just what was in it, but how he organized it all. It was just an incredibly logical system. Okay, so book 1, that's all the general principles. Book 2 dives into simple drugs. Book 3 is this amazing head-to-toe guide on diseases for every organ. Book 4 covers the general stuff, you know, fevers and contagions. And book 5 is basically a huge pharmacy of complex remedies. It was this crystal clear, systematic structure that made it the perfect textbook. And hey, remember his whole idea of tajriba? Well, he applied it directly to medicine. He laid out these rules for clinical trials that are just remarkably modern. First, he insisted that any drug you're testing has to be pure, so you actually know what you're working with. Second, it has to be tested on one single simple disease, so you can isolate the effect. And third, and this is huge, it has to be tested on humans because he realized that what works on animals might not work for people. This right here is basically the foundation of modern pharmacology. And the book was just packed with these incredible insights. He was the very first person to clearly explain the difference between nerves and tendons. He figured out that diseases like tuberculosis were contagious, described the 6 muscles of the eye in detail, and correctly identified the symptoms of diabetes. He even documented that link between our minds and our bodies, noting how a patient's emotional state could dramatically affect their physical health. The man was just centuries ahead of his time. It's that simple. So the canon wasn't just, a hit with the academics. It became the unchallenged medical authority across the entire known world. It built a legacy that was just unrivaled. And the scale of its dominance, it's just staggering to think about. Right away, it became the main medical textbook throughout the Islamic world. Then it gets translated into Latin, and by the late 1200s, it's been adopted by every major university in Europe. And it stayed there, remaining a required textbook in some of Europe's top medical schools all the way into the late 1600s. Sir William Osler, one of the founders of modern medicine, he really put it best. He called the canon a medical Bible for a longer time than any other work. Its system was just so effective that even when new discoveries were made, say in anatomy, universities didn't throw it out. Nope, they just kept the canon as the main framework and added new notes to it. But here's the twist, because while the entire world was embracing his medicine, his philosophy, that whole cure for the soul, was busy igniting one of the most intense intellectual battles of the Middle Ages. Avicenna was so influential, he ended up getting attacked from 2 completely different directions. On one side, you had the theologian Al-Ghazali, who attacked his pure rationalism, saying it was a danger to religious faith. Then, from the other side, the philosopher Averroes fired back, defending philosophy. But then he also criticized Avicenna for straying from pure Aristotle. So Avicenna's work literally became the central battleground for the entire future of medieval thought. So what you end up with is this fascinating dual legacy. On one hand, the world absolutely adopted his practical, systematic medicine, no questions asked. But on the other hand, his philosophy, his attempt to explain all of reality through pure reason, became the subject of this fierce debate that would shape both theology and philosophy for centuries. And all of this kind of leaves us with one final thought. Avicenna built a system of knowledge so powerful, so robust, that it lasted for over 600 years. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other forgotten knowledge, what other systematic ways of thinking from our past are just sitting there, waiting to be rediscovered to help us solve the problems we're facing today?